Next item on the agenda is Commission statement, escalation of gang violence in Sweden and strengthening the fight against organized crime. I will now give the floor to Commissioner Albuquerque for 5 minutes. Please, Commissioner, you have the floor.
Madam President, honourable members, the horrendous attack in Örebro, one of the worst attacks in Swedish history, has shocked us all to the core. And I would like to express my heartfelt condolences to the families and friends who lost their loved ones. Such attacks have no place in Europe. The first thing European citizens expect from us is protection. That is also true when it comes to the topic of today's debate, gang violence. Gang violence is not only a big threat to life and security, it is a huge threat to democracy and society too. And it is part of bigger structures of organised crime infiltrating our legal economies and processes. As outlined by President von der Leyen at the beginning of this mandate, there can be no hiding place for organised crime in Europe, either offline or online. The threat to our internal security by organised crime networks is unprecedented and increasingly visible. And it is not only an impression that we get following the news. Figures speak for themselves. Last year, Europol identified 821 high-risk criminal networks active in the EU. Nearly 90% of them have infiltrated the legal economy, running businesses, investing in real estate. They are strong and operate freely across borders, including online. They are active in drug trafficking, fraud, property crime, migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. To avoid prosecution, these groups are increasingly recruiting young people to perpetrate even violent crimes. Most of this violence is directly linked to organised crime and drug trafficking. Drug-related violence has spread from secluded port areas to the streets of Swedish cities as criminal organisations fight for control over distribution networks. Innocent bystanders are often caught in this violence, underscoring the urgency of action. We see similar patterns across Europe: drug markets in Brussels streets, gang wars in Germany and France, threats to port workers in the Netherlands, drug-related killings in Spain and the Western Balkans. This is a global phenomenon that needs to be tackled through stronger cross-border cooperation within the EU and with third countries. Drugs are now Europe's most lucrative criminal market, worth €31 billion annually. And 70% of organised crime groups use corruption to enable their crimes. The Commission will put forward an EU strategy against corruption. Money is the lifeblood that drives and sustains all these criminal activities. Our response to organised crime must be clear: disrupt their finances, take down their bankers and brokers, tackle the infiltration in the legal economy and disrupt their corrupt networks. Since last spring, we have new confiscation rules to eliminate the profits of criminal groups. We need to follow the money to get to those who are behind these crimes. Any investigation should pursue arrests and asset recovery as two sides of the same coin. With Eurojust, we need to enhance judicial cooperation within the Union and beyond its borders. The rapid transposition of the new Asset Recovery Directive will provide stronger tools to confiscate illicit profits. It will also strengthen the asset recovery offices to identify, trace and freeze criminal assets. The Commission will step up the fight against serious and organised crime with the forthcoming European Internal Security Strategy. The strategy will cover all forms of organised crime, online and offline. We plan to involve all stakeholders in a whole-of-society approach to be more effective in dismantling high-risk criminal networks and their ringleaders. We will propose to revise the rules to fight organised crime, starting with an updated definition of organised crime and strong investigative tools. The strategy will build on the serious and organised crime threat assessment that Europol will present in the spring. We will enhance Europol's support to Member State investigations, especially in areas where the authorities need it the most. We will strengthen Frontex to ensure it can protect our borders in all circumstances. As regards the online dimension, online service providers have a duty to protect their users online. We will continue to strongly enforce the Digital Services Act, which establishes effective measures for tackling illegal content and mitigating societal risks online. And we will continue to step up our efforts in disrupting recruitment of young people online by organised criminal gangs. Next year, we will also set out the framework for an EU critical communication system to strengthen internal security and preparedness. We know that many of the threats to our internal security originate from outside the EU. Security within the Union cannot be achieved without targeted and comprehensive external action through third country partnerships that also benefit our security. The strategy will also address cross-cutting security challenges and hybrid threats, such as border management, the weaponisation of migration, and countering sabotage and espionage. Honourable Members, as one of the first deliverables of the new internal security strategy, the Commission will launch an EU action plan against firearms trafficking with more pressure on criminal markets and safeguarding the licit market. Illicit firearms feed organised crime within the EU and are regularly used by lone actors. The EU already has rules on the legal possession and acquisition of firearms and rules on the legal import, export and transit of firearms. However, there are no EU rules on the definition of criminal offences and penalties on firearms-related crimes. This has to change. The fight against drug trafficking must also remain a top priority. For this, it is paramount to tackle the constant inflow of drugs to our continent, mainly through our ports. Over 90 million containers are processed yearly in EU ports. Only a small percentage are inspected, leaving room for criminal exploitation. Sweden, as a major maritime destination and transit country, is not immune to this threat. We will build on the work set out in the EU Roadmap and the EU Ports Alliance to dismantle criminal business models and to shut down supply routes. Currently, 33 ports, including Helsingborg, Göteborg and Stockholm, are members, and the list is growing. The challenges facing the Union are increasingly complex, interconnected and transnational. This means that we need to approach security in an integrated way, taking all relevant threats, including hybrid ones, into consideration. Internal security is our shared responsibility, and we want the forthcoming strategy to be also the Parliament's strategy. We count on your cooperation to make rapid progress on our common agenda. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I will now give the floor to members representing the groups, starting with Mr. Tobé, representing EPP. You have 2 minutes.
Fru talman, kommissionär.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. The brutal mass murder in Örebro was a black day. The 4th of February, a black day for us all. There was one perpetrator only, but we've also seen that Sweden is being affected by a wave of violence, bombs, attacks against homes every day. Gang criminality, which is spreading. The Swedish government is saying that policy must be adapted, but I think we must do more at European levels. 70% of criminal networks work cross-border. Gang members can attack from abroad the arms or the drugs, the explosives, often come from the outside. It's a cross-border problem. It isn't the case that one member state can cope with this alone. So we need a European security pact against organised crime. No freedom of movement for criminals anymore. And we need a strong European police cooperation. Europol must be strengthened and be more operational. We can and will make sure that Sweden and Europe are secure. The Commission spoke of a strategy against the criminality, and the EPP will help to get that going.
For Mrs. Insia, speaking for SND, you have 3 minutes.
Politics must join forces across party lines to break the cycle of violence. This painful reality is the reason why I decided to engage in politics 25 years ago. Since then, the situation has unfortunately only worsened. More children have become both victims and perpetrators to violence. Last year alone, 44 people lost their lives to shootings, and alarmingly, the number of children under 15 suspected of involvement in murder cases surged by 200% in comparison to the year before in Sweden. Just in the first month of this year, we witnessed 33 bombings. The perpetrators are nowadays so young that the term child soldiers has become a buzzword. Gang violence is creeping down in age, instilling fear in our neighborhoods and robbing children of their childhood. No one should wake up to a sound of a bomb instead of a gentle ring of a clock. And let's be clear, no one is born a child soldier. Our actions as lawmakers matters. The current Swedish right-wing and far-right government looks to Denmark's hard gang laws like visitation zones and harsh penalties, but neglects the essential ingredient of Denmark's success: social investments in school and communities. A school that provides every child with the opportunity to succeed is our most powerful weapon against gang recruitment. It is also absurd that criminals 2025 can start businesses and exploit the Swedish welfare system while the parties in government and their supporters in Sweden Democrats are watching. Where is the crisis commissions that we have asked for? Also, the EU has an important role in putting an end to the cross-border gang crime, which poses a serious threat to all our member states. According to Europol, 70% of gangs in the EU operate in at least 3 countries simultaneously. I'm glad that the Conservative EPP group has woken up and realized the importance of acting, but yet they have only presented what they call European Security Pact against Organised Crime, which is more or less a copy-paste of former Commissioner Ylva Johansson's EU roadmap to fight organised crime and drug trafficking. Instead of creating new titles on existing measures, we Social Democrats demand a specific strategy against recruitment with a coordinator working alongside European authorities such as Europol and Eurojust to prevent children and young people from falling into the claws of the gangs. Politics must unite across party lines, and so must other parts of the society as the social media platforms. We therefore need an EU anti-organised crime law, including addressing the social media platforms' responsibilities. It is unacceptable that these platforms are exploited for recruiting child soldiers. Tech giants must be held accountable. Their platforms are today's modern streets and squares. It is about time for the society to get as organised crime. The society must always be stronger than organised crime.
Thank you. J'appelle maintenant
Mr. Legeri for the Patriots. 2 minutes.
Of not speaking too fast. That would help the translator. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Sweden was a model for safety in Europe, but now it is overwhelmed by gang violence. Criminal explosions, entire neighbourhoods in the hands of the mafia, a direct result of lax immigration policy and a culpable ideology. The figures speak for themselves. In 2023, Sweden had 53 gang murders, one of the highest rates in Europe. 76% of main gang members are immigrants or the children of immigrants. This criminality, which is boosted by the complete failure of integration, is leading to these no-go areas. The Minister of Justice has recognised that it will take more than a decade to eliminate these problems. So after decades of lax policy, Sweden is belatedly trying to expel foreign criminals. But this security fiasco is political in nature. It was Evan Johansson, the previous commissioner, who, when in government in Sweden, applied this open doors policy. The same commissioner was telling us only a few months ago that there wasn't an immigration problem in Europe, and I believe we know where to look when it comes to the responsibility for this security catastrophe. We need a firm policy, we need zero impunity for foreign criminals, and we need immediate expulsions. We need a legal and material rearming of the forces of order. There are no more choices. We need to end mass immigration, which has led to the failure of integration, which has fed into this violence. Sweden is a wake-up call. If we do not act now, France will go the same way. What we're calling for is a Europe which protects its people, rather than a Europe of migratory chaos and lax approach to security.
We'll now call to the floor Mr. Weimer, speaking for ECR. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Broken shards of glass hang like jagged teeth from a shattered window. The frame barely holds. Inside, colorful children's posters decorate the walls. A criminal threw an explosive device into a child's bedroom. One man was injured. This isn't fake news. This is a daily occurrence. This is last night in Sweden. Gang criminals have vowed in secret chats to make 2025 the worst year ever for bombings. Only Albania has more gun deaths than Sweden. Albania. A few years ago, Sweden's former security chief admitted we are in a low-intensity civil war. Yet Swedish media still plays word games. Gate explodes in Nacka. Did the gate self-destruct? Miss shooting in Växjö. A miss because the bullet hit the wrong innocent? Meanwhile, the Swedish Social Democrats are criticizing the tough measures that we in the liberal conservative majority in Sweden are taking against criminality, like visitation zones. Well, go have a debate with your own party that suggested that half of Stockholm was to be done a visitation zone. Flip-flop is what it's called. Now, this is what the EU must do. Acknowledge that this is the result of uncontrolled immigration, accept that we must secure the border, and yes, as the EPP finally has joined our stance to limit free movement of criminals under Schengen. Act decisively to deport the illegals, fake asylum seekers, and terrorist sympathizers. It must be done today. It should have been done yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now call to the floor Mrs. Karlsbro, speaking for Renew. Mrs. Karlsbro, you have 2 minutes.
Fru talman, kommissionen, kollegor.
Colleagues, President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, Sweden has experienced the most horrific multiple killing in recent times, something which has really created great concern throughout Europe. I'm speaking about Örebro. Örebro is in our hearts, and the victims and the families of the victims are in our hearts as well. This particular crime has numerous different aspects, but the consequences of this crime and all crimes is the same. It is a horrific event for society. Violence, gang violence, is something which is spreading throughout Europe. We, the liberals, we want for the European Union to put this particular stamp on criminal gangs, that they are, in other words, terrorists. 70% of these types of organizations are at least in 3 different countries. It's cross-border crime. They have connections with external forces outside of the European Union. We have to fight against this type of crime in Europe. And in Sweden, if we want to be effective, we have to move forward, beef up all activities, beef up police activities, police cooperation between the member states as well. We also have to have a system, a register, a crime register throughout Europe so that we have a clear view of what the situation is overall. We have to draw from the experience in other countries as well, work together with judicial authorities elsewhere. These are elements which are undermining our freedom, our trust in society. We have to act immediately.
Now call to the floor Mrs. Gunke for speaking for Green. You have 2 minutes.
Tack, fru talman. I många områden i Sverige är våldet numera.
Thank you, Madam President. There are many regions of Sweden where violence has now become a terrifying daily reality. There are some neighborhoods where society has been completely taken over by criminal gangs and abandoned by the police. We need to use all the instruments available to us to tackle this problem. Police, social services, educational establishments have all been calling for years for long-term instruments to be put in place so that we can prepare to act, to dismantle and roll back these criminal gangs. Populists and socialists are fighting to show who has the best measures. But that's not a serious way to combat this problem in the longer term. We should be listening to experts on social affairs, experts in schools and in the police force, and we should do what the experts are telling us we should do. How long do we have to wait before we act in that way? Thank you.
Thank you. Now calling to the floor Mr. Sjöstedt, speaking for the left. You have 1 minute and a half.
Tack så mycket, fru talman. Sverige har stora problem med gäng.
Thank you very much. Sweden has a big problem with shootings, explosions, and the police is called in. There are weapons dumps. Criminality has established itself in many neighborhoods, and the link between school dropouts and gang criminality is clear. Children are recruited. We must tackle this and do something in schools. It's no coincidence that towns that don't have endangered neighborhoods have less criminality problems. We need an active policy, which unfortunately is not the case in the Swedish government. Privatization of social services have meant that there are new possibilities for criminals to earn money, and this tendency must be stopped. The Swedish Parliament has a right-wing majority, and that has been the case for more than 17 years. And now we need a new government, not this racist party. We need a new government with a comprehensive policy for equal opportunities and fighting criminality and to strengthen security in society.
Speaking for ESN, you have 1 minute, please.
Schießereien,
shootings, rapes, bombs, That is the result of left-wing policies in Sweden, African gangs and rapes and criminality every day. Malmö is like Baghdad. That is the result of left-wing migration policy. That we can see, and the Sweden Democrats have been elected. It has been pointed out by the media and the Swedish government. Voters have seen the seriousness. The Swedish government have been implemented the program which only AFD stands for in Germany, remigration included, in cooperation with the Christian Democrats, indeed. We must learn from the Swedes. In Berlin, Hamburg and Duisburg, with our neighbourhoods which are controlled by criminal gangs, and every day there are mass rapes, 10 stabbings every day in Berlin. We need the courage of the Swedes. On the 23rd of February, when Germany goes to the polls, we don't need any more firewalls. It's time to act properly.
Mrs. Dupont, I will please ask you not to speak too fast. Makes lives of the translator very hard. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner. Über 70% der kriminellen Netze arbeiten grenzüberschreitend.
Over 70% of these organizations are involved in money laundering, drugs. They operate transnationally. We have over 55 criminal organizations with numerous different nationalities which have been categorized as extremely dangerous. Organized crime was and is a major risk for us, for rule of law, for our economies, for our societies as well. And these networks are using all possibilities. We must do the same. We must use everything in our tool chest to be able to fight them effectively. We have to also look at the financial origins, and we have to have proper confiscation of financial means, of property, and so forth, anything that provides to these organizations. Customs authorities, judicial authorities, special investigation teams have to have access to all relevant information. They are part of our security structure, and they will make our lives better and safer. We have to provide that protection, but this alone will not be enough. The internal security strategy with the preparedness strategy and the white paper will offer us the opportunity, a first step in order to fight these particular structures. We need a democracy which can be resilient and resist and fight against these types of activities. This is the least that we can provide. And finally, on the 23rd of February, the vote will be a vote where the AFD will lose. There will be no coalition. Thank you.
Grazie, President.
Thank you, President. Last month in Sweden, there was an average of one explosion per day in Sweden, but this is not an isolated case. It is a wake-up call for the whole of Europe. I believe the state should intervene earlier, saving our young people from the labour force of crime. There are social networks who are multiplying unease. Think of the murder of Salwan Momika, famous for having burned a Quran in public and killed in January during a live broadcast on TikTok. The state needs to get there sooner. Europe needs to get there before the violence, and we need to get there before it's too late. We need investment in our neighbourhoods, in culture and in education.
Mr. Laszlo, please come to the floor. You have 1.5 minutes.
That we do not have control over the wave of violence is quite obvious. This is a quote from the Swedish Prime Minister and a damning confession. Migrant gang wars have been plaguing Sweden for years now, and bomb attacks surged to a level comparable only to failed states. Citizens are scared and outraged for a reason. Who is to blame? The current government's responsibility is limited in this mess. This is the fault of left-wing elites who allowed mass immigration adhered to the open borders ideology of George Soros. The EU's migration policy is madness. More and more countries refuse to apply the rules. They bring chaos, violence, death, and the breakdown of rule of law. Even in Sweden, even if you are one of the wealthiest and most respected nations on earth, Swedes, this may happen. Swedes simply deserve better. Yet the European Commission is still looking to punish those who defend our common external borders, like my country, Hungary. We need zero tolerance regarding illegal immigration. We need to support all the countries that defend our external borders, and we need to remove all illegals from the EU. And we need to severely punish all violent criminals. Gang warfare in European cities is un-European. The European Commission's weakness on border protection is anti-European. We need to make Europe great again. We need to make European borders secure again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur B. Vous avez 1 minute.
Mr. Bay, 1 minute.
Les gangs.
The criminal gangs are going through Sweden after the lax policies of migration. We have the prices being paid in blood, and it's the first country in terms of deaths by firearms. Secondly, they have such a high share of the population are migrants, 2 million of them. Sweden has tried to change course under the Sweden Democrats and the right. They're changing course, and there's the lowest number of asylum arrivals for 40 years. But in France, it's no better. Today, in the European Parliament, the Interior Minister is here to talk about active retours. And that will be useful for nations and for the peoples. It means that simplification and speeding up expulsions and making them more flexible, all those who come up due to lax policies in Europe, they should be expelled from Europe and not be allowed to come back.
Mrs. Al-Sahlani, you have 2 minutes. Please pay attention with the speed of which you speak. Thank you.
Tack, fru talman, kommissionär, kollegor.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Gang violence is causing major disturbance in Sweden. And we see horrible, brutal acts of violence taking place, illegal activities, crimes, something that comes from, it's not only something that takes place in Sweden, it's outside of Sweden as well. It's a European problem. In Sweden, we've had 33 different explosions in the recent past. And what we now have is a government which has called for a paradigm shift. Unfortunately, that paradigm shift hasn't ended up in anything positive. There are many things that should be in a different fashion, or things that should have been done before. For example, policies should have focused on cutting those particular financial means, those particular flows of cash that are ending up in the hands of gangs. Also, much more work has to be done in education as well, to provide information, to train, to deliver that which is necessary to students so that they understand the gravity of this particular situation. Furthermore, social networks. There should have been a call to reduce the content that might encourage this type of activity. It cannot continue as it is right now. We need social services, assistance. We need control of social networks as well. We have to invest more in education. This hasn't taken place. Instead of putting people out there to do supposedly security work, to put arms out there on the market as well. So indeed, that which should have been done hasn't been done. Those which are against migration, well, they've instrumentalized this particular issue completely, saying, for example, that these are African gangs that are perpetrating all of this violence. Where does this shit, says the speaker, come from, actually?
Så, tack så mycket. Ja.
Yes, indeed. We have a very serious problem in Sweden, but this particular problem is a result of decades and decades of poor migration policy. The moment has come to correct this, and this is what our government is trying to do right now. But you said that migration has nothing to do with delinquency, with criminality. Do you really believe that migration has absolutely nothing to do with this particular phenomena, with all of this that's taking place right now, taking into consideration the high level of migration we have in the country? Well, Madam Saklani, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Are you aware of the fact that the majority of young people, which are part of these criminal gangs, have been born in Sweden? They've gone to school in Sweden as well. How can you forge this particular relationship between migration and this criminality? These individuals are products of our own society, of Sweden as well. It's part of the collapse that we're experiencing right now in society. It has nothing to do with migration. I'm here, just as you are here. Look at what is happening in our country and don't instrumentalize this issue.
1 minute.
1 minute, Ms. Brückner.
Règlement de compte, fusillade.
Showdowns, shootings and contract killings are on the increase in the European streets from Stockholm to Brussels. Unimaginable scenes that make us fear for our safety and that of our children. The organised crime has a profound impact on communities, presents a much greater risk to our democracies and the rule of law, both through its direct effects and through the freedom-limiting responses that we see. No simplistic warmongering or xenophobic discourse will provide the answers that our fellow citizens legitimately expect. We must set an example, act in a coordinated and systematic manner with responses ranging from prevention to repression from our municipalities to the EU level. At EU level, let's step up the fight against corruption by extending the powers of the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Let's show ambition for the Anti-Corruption Directive, Commissioner, and let's ensure means of action from the local to the global level. Develop international judicial cooperation, in particular by putting pressure on states such as Dubai, who harbour drug traffickers, but also by allowing cooperation agreements to be concluded between Eurojust and the countries of Latin America rapidly. Harmonise the European response to organised crime through a European criminal law response. Thank you.
The floor to Mr. Perez. You have 1 minute.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Well, speaking about criminality in Sweden, what we've seen now are 150,000 criminal acts over the last 10 years. We have the importing of bombs of the same thing is happening in Spain as well. It's integration, diversity, living together, and simply accepting this particular totally unacceptable situation. But there's no problem, because in Sweden they've found the magic solution, which is pay 30,000 to each migrant that decides to go back. So first of all, we bring these people into Europe, we provide for them, and then we pay for them to leave. So what's the next step? To provide for them a package return trip and everything for Somalia or for Kabul, not taking into consideration the various problems that already exist. For example, the payment into the supporting of NGOs that are helping these people, these criminals. Thank you.
For 1 minute and a half, please.
Obrigada, Senhora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, Stockholm, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, we're seeing criminal gangs acting like terrorists. And too often, Europe has been very slow and hesitant in its responses. We've seen an instrumentalization of the EU's laws in order to engage in trafficking in human beings, as well as drugs trafficking. 7 out of 10 of the most dangerous criminal gangs involve citizens of many different nationalities, and they operate transnationally. We need to see this as a direct threat to national security, and we need to combat them with the same instruments as we use against terrorism. We need to recognise that crime knows no borders, and our response should know no borders either. The Commission should be given more powers. Criminals should not be able to escape with impunity from one country to another. We should seize assets, prevent the movement of crime gangs. And if people have been convicted of serious offences, they should not be given entry into member states. We should combat illegal trafficking in firearms that contribute to the escalation of violence. We cannot have freedom without security, so we need to combat violence with necessary restrictions of freedom in order to achieve that security.
Card from Mr. Zieper, do you wish to take it? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, colleague, for taking the blue card. I was listening closely to your speech, and at some point you said that we need to treat the drug traffickers in the same way as terrorists. And while I understand the deep emotions that these whole problems bring with it, I think that's a very difficult statement, because we treat terrorists in the most extreme way that our state of law can give. We have full surveillance, we send out heavily armed police. So my question would be, when we look at those gangs, on which stage of the gang level you have to be treated like that? Is it only for the bosses or also for the runners? Where would you draw the line in the sand? Thank you.
Eu não vou responder a essa...
That question is populist. What I'm saying is, without security we don't have freedom. Without freedom we don't have the EU. I'm not going to go further than that.
Mr. Lopez Aguilar, you have the floor for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidenta. Thank you very much, President. Now, we see this particular problem in Sweden, but it's actually throughout Europe. Organized crime is the crime of our times, number one. Number two, the number of adolescents, underage individuals, embroiled in this type of activity as well. But social networks, nothing is being done about this right now, and this is a very serious problem. Undoubtedly, this has been used and instrumentalized against the Social Democrat government in Sweden, the prior government as well. But it's quite clear what has to be done. We need judicial police cooperation, and then we have to take into consideration all of the experience of Eurojust and Europol to confiscate not only arms, but also illicit funds as well that are used. We have to use digital implements against this type of crime as well. We have to have proper technology deployed to fight this type of organized crime. And we have to fight the exclusion, the alienation of individuals that leads to organized crime. Thank you.
1 minute and a half.
1 minute and a half. Sweden used to be one of the safest countries in Europe, is ravaged by gang crime. There were hundreds of shootings and 53 deaths last year. And no other country in Europe has had such a high increase in the number of immigrants. Gang criminality, shootings, bombings, all the aspects of crime, and some of the perpetrators are recruited at the age of 12. The Swedish authorities admit that this wave of crime is the fruit of lax policies. The foreign policy in a number of years has gone from 2 to 15%, and we have gangs like Foxtrot foxtrot, which is also spreading its tentacles to Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and in France too, we're having the state rule of law replaced. And Sweden is turning a corner, finally, with the expulsion of migrants and toughening asylum policies. And let's have a strict control of national borders and throughout Europe. And we should have zero tolerance of criminality. And we're talking about human lives. Let's act before it is too late. You have a blue card from Miss Insia, madam. A blue card from Miss Insia. Would you like to take it?
Je vais juste me mettre en français.
Colleagues, let's see if you could do this brain exercise. Put migration and migrants aside instead of constantly blaming everything on migration and migrants. Do you think that it's correct that your friends in the Sweden Democrats, for example, does nothing in order to put the money where it should be, in the schools and the preventive works? And do you think that it is okay that your colleagues in the Sweden Democrats, for example, does nothing to ensure that the criminal gangs cannot take out taxpayers' money through running welfare businesses? The privatization businesses has gone too far in Sweden without them doing anything.
Thank you. Madame Androuet, vous avez la parole.
Miss Androuet, I'm a bit surprised by your political reply, which consists of investing in schools, which has nothing to do with imported violence. We talk about one of the countries where the level of investment for upbringing children in Sweden is high. And, excuse me, all the figures throughout Europe, not just in Sweden, this violence is largely imported. I know that doesn't please you.
I will now call to the floor Mr. Inselvini, and you have 1 minute, please.
Qualcuno evidentemente.
Somebody clearly needs a new pair of glasses. What's happening in Sweden and in other cities across Europe has made it crystal clear that those ideologically designed spectacles of the left are not letting them see reality. We're seeing crime, drugs crime and insecurity because of well-meaning liberals pro-immigration on the left. Put on glasses that will show you the real picture. Combating uncontrolled immigration, combat all drugs, put police on the streets. The Meloni government has been going down this path for some time in Italy. All Europeans want to get the freedom back to live in their own to live in their own cities safely.
Calling to the floor, Mrs. Garcia Remida van der Waale. U heeft 2 minuten.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Let me begin by expressing my deepest condolences with the families and friends of the shooting in Sweden, and of course to the Swedish people as a whole. You know, the far right of this chamber has only one solution for fighting organised crime. Let's close our borders and take back our country. But here comes a reality check. You know, criminals are laughing at your obsession with closing borders. For them, it's just a line. It's the point where they can shake off the national police. They operate extremely efficiently across borders, using bribes, laundering money through your beloved cryptocurrency, trafficking in weapons, and recruiting new, very often very young members for their gangs. Stop misleading Europeans with your naive idea of sovereignty and invest instead in our EU police and justice cooperation. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the American government was fighting their own criminal gangs, the mafia, they tried closing state borders and demonizing migrants. Yeah, you know, Mr. Salvini, yeah, those Italians, they were really bad. And the colleagues from Peace, the Poles, very bad, no good. Well, that did not work. But you know what worked? Founding the FBI. That did the trick. What Europe needs is a truly operational Europol, a European FBI, with reinforced means, with oversight and with accountability. Also, Eurojust and the European Public Prosecutor's Office urgently need more competences, as they have shown to be extremely effective and instrumental in fighting organised crime. Commission, absent Council, step up to the challenge. Give our common security the priority it needs. And to my colleagues, if you are really serious about fighting crime, then you will support every single effort in this House at European level. And if you're not, then you're just interested in creating clickbait for your socials, and I suggest you sit this one out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have a blue card from Mrs. Mertens. Do you want to take it?
Hier bin ich. Vielen Dank für die Akzeptanz der Blue.
Thank you very much for taking the blue card. I found that the support of security authorities important, but I think it's critical that Europol, that it operates operatively, because I feel that we need to focus on national authorities at this point. We have to kind of go right into the issue, and nationally we have to prosecute more effectively nationally before we go at the European level. That afterwards, but at the national level we really do have to focus right now.
Thank you so much, colleague, for your question. I do agree that strengthening our police forces at national level is important, but international criminals need a counterpart. They need someone at international level to fight them, and that's why we need a fully operational Europol. It's not this or this, it's together. I will say this, though. We know that there are crimes which are not being prosecuted in Europe because national police forces refused to intervene. So as the case in Malta with the assassination or the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. So we do have an operational force above them to intervene where necessary.
Thank you, Mrs. Lovin. You have the floor for 1 minute.
Fru talman, början på det här året har...
Madam President, first of all, I would say it's a difficult time for Sweden. More than 30 explosions took place last week because of gang criminality and shootings. It's a very difficult time for us, and we think of the victims and their family members. This violence is a symptom of something other which is not working. Sweden must come together, and the authorities, society, all citizens must come together, work together, so that everybody in our country can have a meaningful life, and violence is not an option. We have a task here, but we must be an example and show a good example. And in terms of decency, we must think about how we deal with each other, how we speak to each other, and go further to the right. We must sit down side by side and have respect for the other, and also for differences.
Have 1 minute, please.
Dear people of Europe, the title of this debate is, in my humble opinion, all wrong. As many colleagues have pointed out, the problem that we are facing is not a Swedish one, it is European, with a strong worldwide aspect to it. Just last week, the ambassador of Ecuador told us that it's the Albanian mafia being in control of the cocaine shipping out of the port of Guayaquil in Ecuador. Albanian mafia in Ecuador. Let that sink in for a moment. It is always drug trafficking gangs that enact the worst violence, and these gangs do not fight about the market of Sweden, of Italy, or of Luxembourg. They fight about Europe, and so there can only be a European solution. We need to strengthen Europol and let it take over some responsibilities from the national police forces. We need to expand funding for the European Union Drug Agency, and we need to legalize or criminalize the same drugs in the same countries all over Europe. Only if we start tackling this European issue as such, we will stand a chance. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now calling Mrs. Teodorescu Mauve. You have 1 minute and a half.
Tack, fru talman. Låt oss...
Thank you, President. Let's blow up and shoot guys. We'll make 2025 the best year in history with explosions, right? Gang criminals in social media channels, messaging channels where murder missions are outsourced to child soldiers who are queuing up for them. During 28 days in January, 32 explosions took place in Sweden. What we're seeing now is unprecedented in the Western world. It resembles a civil war, instilling great fear and damaging trust in the state and between people. The freedom of the decent majority can only be regained by curtailing it for the criminal minority. The EPP Stockholm Declaration points the way. Strengthen Frontex, Europol, European Public Prosecutor's Office and the Anti-Fraud Office. Tighten money laundering legislation and make it easier to seize and confiscate criminals' assets. Gang crime has not emerged in a vacuum. It is the consequence of politically driven societal changes that have been brought in on many occasions by the left. Value conflicts and lax integration policies have led to this. It is the task of politicians, as well as taking repressive measures, to address the fact that every society needs a basic set of values, an ethical minimum. These basic, non-optional values are the prerequisite for people to choose to create, instead of destroying, the society they have been given on loan.
Mrs. Grappini, you have 1 minute.
Doamna președintă, doamna comisar.
Madam President, Commissioner, dear colleagues, we are discussing very sad matters, and it's not the first time. I would like to extend my condolences to the people who have lost their children, not just in Sweden. Let's remember the attack in Germany at Christmas. Let's remember the events in Brussels recently. Commissioner, I think we have to tell the truth. Democracy has been badly managed. Democracy does not entail giving up security. On the contrary, let's see what we can do. There are countries that have legislated and regulated guns and drugs. We've talked about that here. And what happens? Everybody now has guns in the house and goes in streets and in schools shooting people. Democracy does not mean chaos. It means orders. It means responsibilities as well as rights. And we haven't had the courage to say that because we were afraid that we might be accused that we're not democratic. That is my understanding of democracy. We need more security, and we need to know that we are safe in our house and in our cities. Thank you.
Vous avez 1 minute et demie.
Ms. Piera, 1.5 minutes.
Une criminalité organisée
Organised crime out of control, shootouts, criminal gangs, extortion activities everywhere. No one is safe now across Europe. A descent into hell for Sweden. 1.6 per million firearms deaths in Europe, 4 in Sweden. Over 300 deaths, 10 in one shooting 10 days ago. The Swedish Prime Minister has been brave enough to take things on and tackle them. It has been an open migration policy which was irresponsible that led to this. 200 gangs coming from sub-Saharan Africa, from Turkey, Kurds, Syrian networks. It's the law of the mafia being put into place right across different spheres of society. We're seeing rapid recruitment, 15 to 20-year-olds, even as young as 12, with young girls being lured into prostitution. We need to look at things as they are. we've gone from 2 to 15% non-Western population in Sweden. That is what this blind and ultimately criminal open migration policy has done. It will take 10 years to win the battle in Sweden, in France and elsewhere, everywhere where criminal gangs are present. Where will we be in 10 years' time?
Give the floor to Mr. Buczynski. You have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, in 2015, Angela Merkel switched into the fifth gear while implementing this idiot policy of multi-culti. When she opened wide the European borders, the head of my party in Poland, Jarosław Kaczyński, was giving a warning to Europe, talking about Stockholm. He said that there are more than 50 areas in Sweden where Sharia law is adopted and the Swedish police cannot enter. And then everybody reacted, responding that it was not true. And Donald Tusk was threatening those countries which would not accept illegal migrants with imposing fines. Right now, we are all citizens of Sweden as well. We are with the citizens of Sweden. We want our children to come back home safe, but we will never win against such criminality if we keep being tied down by our timidity or the rules. You have clearly seen the situation in other countries. You have fired the head of Frontex because it was supporting us. You are hypocrites.
Please, you have the floor for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner, reality cannot be ignored anymore. From France all the way up to Sweden, there are more and more terrorist attacks, street shootings linked to drug and human trafficking, and gang-related assassinations. More and more innocent victims and ruined lives. These are criminal acts predominantly involving individuals and groups with a migration background. How did we get there? We know the answer. The pretense that cultural differences are irrelevant, the illusion of an inclusive society, procedures granting fast-track citizenship, the tolerance of illegal migration. In reality, tens of thousands of second-generation EU citizens of migrant backgrounds have become socially marginalised and pushed to the periphery. From there, for many of them, it was only a short step towards religious radicalisation or organised crime. We do not have years to correct the mistakes of past decades. The safety of citizens in Sweden, in Belgium, in France must be ensured today. Law enforcement must be strengthened both in numbers and weaponry. Investigative procedures must be accelerated. Criminal gangs must be dismantled. Migrants in irregular situations must be returned.
Thank you
and
very
the EU
much.
can and shall
Your
assist
time is up.
through coordination.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You will have the opportunity if you want to speak more because you have a blue card from Mrs. Garcia.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Vince. I think that we share the concern for radicalisation of different groups in our youth. I would like to ask you about the recent report from Europol about terrorist threats, where it becomes very clear that the methods and the success rate of radicalisation via online media, for example, at the hands of extreme Islamist groups and extreme rights groups in the EU are exactly the same. And how do you reflect on that, given your contribution?
Thank you. Well, I believe that for the EU, it is important to find the right way for coordination, institutional and financial support for cross-border law enforcement. Yes, education is important, but it's equally important the environment in which those children live. And we know, unfortunately, in many Western European societies, parallel neighbourhoods grew up, and that made it impossible for children to be integrated in those societies, and they went on the road of radicalisation, and they were reached out by criminal gangs. And this is something we need to tackle, and it will be not easy.
Thank you very much.
National efforts and coordination both are extremely important.
Mrs. Sardone, you have the floor for 1 minute.
Non avete il coraggio di dire.
You're not brave enough to say that illegal immigration has caused the rise of criminal gangs who are ever more dangerous right around Europe, Sweden, Germany, Belgium, France, Italy. We're seeing more and more criminal gangs with ever younger people engaging in attacks, vandalism, murders and attacks. This is because for too long we've had indiscriminate migration, open-door policy, well-meaning but damaging policies from the left, where you're still denying that there is a connection between illegal immigration and crime. We're seeing no-go areas and ghettos in our cities. The police don't dare go in. Laws and rules no longer apply. When will you finally understand that when you call for more immigration, you're undermining the security of Europe's citizens?
Mrs. Sardone, you have a blue card from Mr. Sieper. Do you want to accept it? It's the last blue card for this debate of Mr. Sieper, so he's very glad you take it.
Illegale Migration führt zu Kriminalität.
Illegal migration leads to criminality. You don't have to be courageous to say that. Nobody argues about that. Don't you think that if people with a migration background hadn't been made impoverished, had been put in poor neighbourhoods, if they'd given them a labour permit, if they'd been treated equally in our society, don't you think that there'd be less criminality from this part of the population?
Guardi,
Well, let me tell you what's happening in my country. If someone turns up as a legal migrant, they have exactly the same rights as Italian citizens. So the state isn't pushing them into crime. My question to you would be, if what you say is true, and if the left were right, then why would we see this situation in Sweden where the centre-right wins, saying this policy of the left for years and years has failed?
Mr. Tinkinen, please come to the floor. You have 1 minute. Thank you.
Madam President, Sweden has been a country that many people have looked at admiringly. Since then, this happy and prosperous nation has been corrupted to the point where it is no longer recognizable as it once was. Totally unrestricted migration has been allowed to sweep over Sweden like a tidal wave. It has turned neighbourhoods into no-go areas. It has made streets unsafe and created an epidemic of gang crime with explosions and shootings, which, according to the Swedish government, is no longer under control. Imagine the chaos a country must be in for the Prime Minister to have to say this. The situation is no longer under control. But eyes are beginning to open now, even in Sweden. According to the Prime Minister, tighter immigration policy must continue if Sweden is to overcome this. So that's the message for the whole of Europe. Let's not repeat Sweden's terrible human experiment. Let's tighten up immigration policy so that Europe can survive.
Mr. You're Mr. Holmgren. Yes.
Tack så mycket, fru talman, och tack för den här debatten.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President. And I'd like to thank you for this debate as well. Now, we've seen a very, very clear presence of violence in my city Uppsala. And the same thing is taking place in many other Swedish cities as well. Aside from this violence, what we're feeling is that our society needs more needs to be done to fight violence. We need more investment in society, more investment in our schools, in our educational system. The security forces, maybe it's not necessary to use them in this very, very beefed up fashion as has been. Of course, they have a major responsibility to play. But I think indeed what we do have to focus on is social investment. But the issue is, what are we going to do not only with these gangs, but with the leaders of these gangs? What are we going to do to improve the communities, the neighborhoods, society overall, to create a sense of responsibility? So I think in this particular debate, we have to make it quite clear. We're hearing a lot about racism, populism, and all of this actually is because of ignorance and nothing else.
Jag är lite nyfiken.
Yes.
Bättre skola, bättre socialtjänst och att vi pratar lite fint.
From the Green Party, do you think indeed that it's the social services that are failing? Do you think that will solve the problem? Do you think that will be sufficient if we have investment there? We've been very, very generous as far as migration policy. And I think much more needs to be done on numerous different fronts. It's not just the issue of social investments. It's migrants. It's the problems that exist there. Don't you see any connection here? Well, I think I was very clear in my presentation. What we have to do is we have to listen to the experts, to science, to be able to solve the problems. We have to listen to see what the police say about increases in their resources and what they have at their disposal, for example, and what sort of reverberations that has. We have to invest more in the educational system. We have to invest more in policies, but in the police as well, so that they're visible in society, so that they are a presence. And we ought not allow for this particular correlation to be forged between migration and delinquency, gang crimes. These are not serious analyses of the problem. We have to look at things in a much more, if you like, well-based scientific fashion. Many of the individuals involved in these groups are born in Sweden. They are Swedes.
1.5 minutes.
Sehr geehrte Frau
Madam President, colleagues, mass gang criminality that we've seen in Sweden for some years is alarming. But in other EU countries, violence is increasing, as has been shown by the shootings in Brussels. This challenge can only be tackled at a European level because organised criminality doesn't stop at borders. The perpetrators benefit from freedom of movement, and our rules are tied to national states. But so the law enforcement authorities must be better networked in Europe, and also with Europol and Eurojust and the European Public Prosecutor. They all need more powers. The good projects that already exist, there must be more of them, and must become a lot more widespread, because we can't use small-scale approaches in this, and we must become more powerful in investigations, but also in the judiciary. A digital arrest order is necessary to smash the networks. We need more access to digital data to get the people behind all this. In the justice, we need more efficient criminal processes throughout Europe. We can learn best practices from each other. Europe must be able to act. Our freedom must not become a weakness. It must be our strength. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Jamet. Vous avez 1 minute et demie.
1.5 minutes.
Oui.
Yes. The war of gangs in Sweden seems to be affecting Europe. Sweden is a prosperous country with a rate of criminality which is the lowest in the world. But it means that they've had a mad immigration policy which has led to an explosion of organised crime. So that could be seen as a warning, as in Brussels 10 days ago, in Berlin, in Montpellier. The list of towns we could mention is long. and the reaction time also, because faced with that, have taken the side of the criminals. They have petrified in the face of European rulings. They've taken the side of, they've looked the other way. And that shows the state of the rule of law, which has been, and the EU has been sapped of its authority in our prisons, in our everyday lives and our borders. It is the dealers and the criminals who hold sway with their Kalashnikovs in front of our schools. We need to put an end to that. We need to defend the security of our citizens and their interests ahead of the criminals and the illegals by supporting our police forces. Thank you very much.
Merci. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Gojewska. You have 1 minute. Thank you.
Gunfights, assassinations, rapes, gangs that intimidate residents. This is already a daily reality in Sweden, which until recently was a safe country. These dramatic events are the result of the open-door policy that left-wing politicians have been pursuing for years. All those who opposed this policy, including my own group, were accused of xenophobia. During the 8 years of the Law and Justice government, we successfully defended Poland against the influx of invading migrants, including those who were brought in by Lukashenko. It was at the time that the current Prime Minister Tusk, your favorite, threatened Poles with penalties for not accepting migrants, and the members of his party attacked Polish border guards. All of this to gain your support in the elections, and he is paying with Poland's security for this. Today, the European bureaucracy is forcing my country to accept migrants. Prime Minister Tusk is pretending that he does not agree, but we all know that this is simply a deception for electoral purposes. Soon, the Poles, like the Swedes, the Germans and the French, will have to face the consequences of your harmful decisions. You want to rule the world, and you are dragging Europe down to the very bottom.
You have 1 minute and a half, please.
Thank you very much, President, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In Sweden, there's an explosion of gang violence taking on truly mythical proportions, and I'd like to thank colleague Tobé and others as well for having put this on the agenda of the European Parliament. Sweden is just like my country, Austria. We know that the situation over the last 30 years, this particular transnational, transborder phenomena that's developed, well, actually, this is the place to discuss these types of things because of the numerous different countries involved. We have to process the information, and we have to find some sort of solution as well. Now, first of all, I do feel that the problem, we have to really look at it closely, scrutinize the problem. Now, some here feel that this is exclusively an issue concerning immigration, and we've heard others who say quite clear that it has nothing to do with migration. I think both theses are wrong. It has to do with migration, and sanctions are necessary, and we have to look outside of the European Union as well. We have to have prosecuting authorities active outside of national borders. But prevention is important as well. We need to look at our values, freedom, human rights, rule of law. These particular issues have to be focused on as well, and the responsibilities that go along with these particular fundamental rights and liberties. There's great responsibility. Let's emphasize that for migrants and for nationals as well. So I'd like to thank you all very much.
The floor to Mrs. Bartuszek. You have 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Dámy a pánové, jedna bomba denně.
Ladies and gentlemen, 1 bomb a day. That is the state of play in Sweden last month. Smugglers, gangs, criminal crime, organized crime, are doing this in Sweden towns. Sweden used to be a peaceful country with a low rate of crime, but that's no longer the case. Sweden has become a victim of naivety. And in Sweden, There is the second highest number of deaths because of firearms. This is a major warning. A warning that we have cheap labour flooding our labour markets. This cheap labour also brings criminality and terrorism with it. Sweden isn't a safe country anymore. Sweden is seeing the highest number of terrorist attacks. We don't know who is moving around Europe. We must be aware of the reality. The fundamental values have failed. We must be aware of the errors. We mustn't close our eyes anymore. We must be stricter on crime. We must be stricter on money laundering and gang crime. It's about the security of our fellow citizens.
Mr. Sienkiewicz, you have 1 minute.
Kolejny raz mówię na tej sali.
Once again, I'm speaking in this chamber about organized crime, which is the greatest threat to security in our streets. We are afraid of the customs war with the United States of America, but a far more important problem relates to the organized gangs in Europe, which is in direct relation to the migration policy to date. Madam Commissioner, we must not keep closing our eyes and looking elsewhere. We cannot afford things such as migration pact. I expect that the European Commission should present us a plan which would be commensurate with the situation. Otherwise, we are threatened with social disintegration greater than any external threats. And I do not really sense that the European Commission sees the importance of this threat. We must react immediately. Otherwise, what happened in Sweden today will be our future for the whole Europe.
Ahora tiene la palabra el señor.
Mr. Sokol now for 1 minute.
Thank you. Sweden used to be known for safety and security, but in recent years it is facing an increase in criminality at alarming rates. Gothenburg, Malmo and Stockholm streets are faced with regular violence. What is especially worrying is that the young people are those committing the crimes. The number of perpetrators aged between 15 and 20 raised almost 4 times since 2014. What has happened in the last 10 years that could have caused such a situation? Maybe this has something to do with the increase of migration. Are we going to continue living on a cloud 9 and avoid debate just because of political correctness? Stopping mass migration, the introduction of stricter sanctions for perpetrators and the strengthening of police competences, as well as eliminating criminals from the territory of the European Union, all these are measures that have to be taken. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking the survival of Europe here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move on to the Catch the Eye. And we have 4 who have expressed an interest in taking the floor. 1 minute for each of you. And from your seat there, our first speaker is colleague Johnski.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, President. This debate on the situation of Sweden, however, the politicians of Kaczyński's party from Poland, they just want to lie in this chamber once again. Why? Because we will have elections soon again, and they think they can lie with impunity here. But if anyone is responsible for trading security and threatening security in Poland, that would be Kaczyński's party. One of their ministers is being now investigated. There is an investigative commission in our parliament. You could buy Polish visas in Asia or in Africa, and this is something that we should be talking about loud and clear. And I want to say it very, very clearly. Donald Tusk last week, together with Ursula von der Leyen, said clearly Poland will not implement the migration pact. And this is it. And everybody knows in Poland why. We took 2 million of people from Ukraine. We are helping as much as we can. And that is why we will not implement the migration pact. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Madam Tingrin, for 1 minute, please.
Tack så mycket. Mina föräldrar...
Thank you. My parents grew up in one of the safest countries in the world. My children, unfortunately, cannot do the same. The crime rates in Sweden now are not a one-off. It's not to do with problems with schools or society. This is a violence which is due to a failed left-wing policy. This violence is imported. The figures demonstrate very clearly that persons of foreign origin are overrepresented in cases of violence. The consequences of this are evident. The Social Democrats didn't see this coming, but we had predicted this. The consequences are we won the elections and we've been accused of xenophobia. They've been trying to redirect the debate and say that Sweden Democrats are pyromaniacs pouring oil on the flames just so we don't have to talk about the problem.
Para el señor Gheadi, por...
Now, Mr. Yadis, for 1 minute, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, we ought to express our solidarity with Sweden and the people of Sweden. Let's, however, not turn a blind eye. The best way to deal with this is to deal with migration policy. The policy of open borders, of integration, it has simply failed. We need a new type of policy from Sweden to Italy, from Spain to Cyprus, and only with a newfangled approach to migration will we be able to secure the people of Europe and make sure they live safely. Our last speaker is colleague Jovanovic for 1 minute, please.
Mulțumesc. Thank you. I have heard you blame one another from the right to the left, from the left to the right. But with all due respect, people have died. Young people are dying. The only thing that we are lacking in Europe and in the whole world is education. It is very poor in Europe. And let me remind you, children need rules, children need authority, children need to be punished every now and then. They should not be beaten savagely, but they should be punished. They need clear rules to be established for themselves because they turn into abusers once they have grown up. Yes, free access to guns, migration, problems. It is a very serious threat. Have you considered the number of weapons entering Europe from Ukraine? Do you know that the port of Constanza has let in huge quantities of drugs since you've allowed Ukrainians to come in Europe? And this is what the UN report says. It is not my own report. You should wake up and you should change the education system. You should stop Ukrainians from leaving their country. You should stop financing the war. And you should stop all this Interpol and violence forces thing. Thank you.
Ahora tiene la palabra para...
Now the Commission shall respond. Commissioner Albuquerque, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Honourable members, having listened to this debate, I think we all agree that we need to do a lot and fast. That is why next month the Commission will propose a comprehensive internal security strategy. It will be a strategic blueprint for the Commission's security priorities. This long-term planning will shape our approach to research, innovation, procurement and operational deployment, improving our joint fight against organised crime and drug trafficking. We will put all our energy into ensuring a stronger, more effective and better coordinated EU-wide response to organised crime. We must put an end to this escalating threat and restore the control over our communities and our borders to protect the safety of citizens in Sweden and across the EU. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Con esto daríamos.
Thank you very much. We close this particular agenda point and this debate as well, and we move on to the next agenda point and the next debate. As you know, it's a Parliament statement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the need for the European Union to contribute to resolving the humanitarian crisis of persons missing in wars and conflicts. First of all, we have the groups, and our first speaker will be Mr. Mandel on behalf of the EPP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. When a person goes missing and remains missing, not only this person is affected in the one or the other way, but many people around. Friends and family, parents and children would be affected by that. And it's a pity that we have to say today the absolute rule to avoid persons going missing, also in armed conflict, is not respected anymore. There are more and more missing persons, especially Ukraine is suffering, Ukrainian children, men and women are suffering, especially, as we all know, children from Ukraine in a large number would be brought to Russia and maybe other places. We don't know about their whereabouts. They go missing. The International Red Cross documents that more and more persons go missing. This is why in the European Parliament we time and again have to underline and emphasise the importance of human rights, of humanitarian law, and among humanitarian law rules to avoid persons going missing is one major rule. Of course, also the migration routes, which are caused by human trafficking, by smugglers, by organised crime, are places where persons go missing. 60,000 and more in Ukraine, 40,000 and more documented by the Red Cross, nearly 30,000 only in the last years in the Mediterranean when it's about illegal migration routes. And there are also regimes on this planet who purposely use persons going missing against their own population. This is something that happens in North Korea, this is something that happens in the Iranian Mullah regime, and this is something that's also used against Europe when it comes to illegal migration, many times purposely. This is why it's so important to emphasise this issue and to bring it on the table of this very European Parliament.
Thank you very much. Take into account that it's not only one round speech at the service of the chamber. It's telling to me that the speeches should be done in front of the chamber. And then the next speaker, it will be Mr. Mavridis for 1 minute.
Apologize, Mr. President. Running from one committee to another. In 2001, the European Court of Human Rights found Turkey guilty for a continued violation of a number of conventions articles, specifically with regards to the whereabouts and fate of Greek Cypriot missing persons during the Turkish invasion of 1974. Since then, as the European Parliament, we condemn Turkey for its actions, specifically for intentional removal of human remains in its efforts to cover up its original crimes committed by the Turkish army and the state orders. Despite court decisions, Turkey refuses today, as of today, to provide crucial information such as access to military archives and access to so-called military zones. This behavior is simply an extension of the original crime 50 years ago, and this country remains to be in accession process.
Muchas gracias. Ahora la
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Yathis for a minute and a half from the ECR. Mr. Yathis, please. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every individual has a right to life, freedom, and personal security. Unfortunately, the horror of war makes no distinction. There are thousands missing with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Also, the Hamas attack in Israel as well. Many missing there. And the blacklist includes Cyprus as well. Following the Turkish invasion and the illegal occupation, Turkish barbarism has left behind 1,609 missing individuals. Old people, women, children, they're all included in this long list. Turkey has not cooperated. It has not responded to international invitations. It has failed to respond to the court. 3450, that particular resolution of the UN has been ignored as well. And why ought it do otherwise when high officials of the European Union, rather than call for Turkey to meet its responsibilities on this front, they don't do anything. They call it a strategic partner. So, with the tragic individuals, that these individuals have disappeared. Nobody knows where they are, where they've gone, if they're alive or not. We have to look into the eyes of these girls who have become mothers, grandmothers, people who ask what has happened to their family, to their mothers, to their fathers, to their grandparents. Thank you very much. I'd like to remind the speaker that we do not display images in the course of our interventions. Our next speaker is Mr. Sartouri for 1 minute on behalf of the Greens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, every time somebody disappears, there's a person behind that, there's a community behind that, suffering from the uncertainty, the lack of knowledge about what has happened to their loved one. But they can be forgotten by the international community. But the children of Ukraine that were seized by the Russian regime, the Israeli hostages captured by Hamas, the thousands of Palestinian civilians killed anonymously or secretly imprisoned are all in this category. Well, we must remember them. South Sudan, common graves in Ukraine, Gaza, DRC, Syria. We cannot be selective. International humanitarian law forbids this. We need to stop disappearances, provide information about where people have been detained or if they have died. The families of the disappeared continue to be torn apart by this. We need to apply international law by the forces of justice. We need to protect the instruments of international justice, such as the International Criminal Court, to pursue those in South Sudan, Putin, Netanyahu, and those of Hamas for their crimes against humanity. The families of the disappeared have a right to justice. That is the only viable path to peace.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Georgiou for 1.5 minutes on behalf of the left. Thank you very much, President. I'm quite impressed by the fact that some people see missing individuals only in Ukraine, and for Gaza, they tell us something, but they don't say anything much about that, nor do they speak about the tens of thousands missing because of the dictatorial regimes that existed in Europe as well. Of course, we have on Cyprus as well many missing individuals. For many decades, the issue on Cyprus of missing individuals, perhaps the most tragic dimension of this problem continues to exist. The list includes Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots as well, and the pain of family members is shared by all. Of course, the Bicommunal Commission, which is there, is supported by the European Union, but nonetheless, Turkey continues to place numerous different impediments as far as their being able to do their work, and thus the European Union and other international agencies are unable to move forward effectively. It's time for the European Union to push for Turkey to open up its military archives on this matter. The case of the region of Asha, my town, there the Turkish soldiers executed 70 individuals, which were then thrown into a well, and there were others that were thrown elsewhere as well. My uncle, Cleanthes, was one of those individuals. We want to be able to have the remains of these individuals, to bury them properly, to have a proper memory of these individuals, some sort of memorial, and for the truth to finally be revealed as to the fate of these people. Now, that's it for the groups, and we move on to Madam Zofko now, EPP.
Gracias. Govoreći danas o univerzalnoj deklaraciji
I will be speaking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the context of wars, and conflicts and geopolitical tensions, and it arose as a response to injustice and breach of fundamental rights. The aggression on the Republic of Croatia in 1991 brought about a lot of suffering. Thousands of Croatian veterans and soldiers were taken away and imprisoned, and despite time having gone by, we're still facing certain consequences of the war. 1,782 people are still missing. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, 7,608 people are still missing. We cannot leave the quest for justice to be left unquenched. I'm requesting for Serbia to share information and to enable for the destinies of people who are missing to be resolved. The EU must use its negotiating power and make sure that this issue is placed highly on the agenda of accession talks. Accession to the EU means truth and human rights, and there should be no compromises when it comes to that. Families who are suffering and still searching for their family members mean that we have to be responsible. It is unacceptable that people who hold the information about the missing people are still silent. Without the opening of archives, we should not conclude accession talks.
Thank you very much, Madam Ingir. Now for 1 minute.
Nunca más, never again, became the rallying slogan for justice, truth and accountability in Argentina and across Latin America in the 1980s. The transitional justice movements that followed across the world have proven a fundamental truth. No society can achieve peace without confronting the legacies of political violence and human rights violations. After 54 years of authoritarian rule and 14 years of brutal conflict, Syria remains scarred by enforced disappearance, torture and mass graves. Tens of thousands are still missing. Families are left without answers and communities are searching for closure. The European Union must remain at the forefront of transitional justice efforts in Syria. The work of UN accountability mechanism and UN's missing persons institution will be essential in this process and deserves all our full support. Truth and accountability are the strongest defense against renewed authoritarianism and impunity.
Muchas gracias. Ahora es el turno para la vicepresidenta.
Thank you very much. For the ECR now, colleague Zberna.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, today, the 10th of February, is a day of memorials in Italy to remember Italian victims of the people forced into exile from the Dalmatian region. There are many families who've been left without news and never knowing the whereabouts of their loved ones. There are so many conflicts now with thousands of people disappearing without trace. In Cyprus, 50 years on from the Turkish invasion, there are still many disappeared. In the Balkan wars of the 90s, there were many cases. In Ukraine, thousands of children deported, separated from their families, victims of an injustice that has seared through several generations. Technology can be a vital ally in locating missing persons. Satellite tracing, tracking can help us find people and provide essential evidence to identify victims and return their dignity. The EU should invest in such technology. But as well as technology, we need a political will. The EU should put in place mechanisms for tracing missing persons so that families can find the truth. The right to truth never expires. People are still searching. Families are still searching. And we have the duty to be at their side and turn European values into concrete action.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much, Madam Neumann. Now for 1 minute from the Greens.
Bring out the dead dogs. That's how prison guards ordered inmates to carry out the bodies of those who died overnight in Sinai prison in Syria. What happened to those bodies? Nobody knows. For decades, the Assad regime has used forced disappearances as a tool of repression. More than 100,000 people have disappeared under his rule. Over 100,000 remain missing today. Now, for the first time in decades, there is a real chance to uncover the truth. Syrian experts are already on the ground, documenting crimes, exhuming mass graves, protecting evidence, but they need our support, financially and politically, to fund Syrian civil society working for truth, justice and reconciliation, to press Syria's new rulers to make transitional justice a priority, to strengthen UN mechanism on missing people, to ensure independent investigations. Because this is the only way to hold perpetrators accountable, to help families find out what happened to their loved ones, and to support Syrians rebuilding a country that heals its wounds and will be a free country for everyone.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Arvanitis for 1 minute. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I agree with our colleague from the Socialists who had asked in the previous term for a foundation concerning and supporting missing individuals to be established. We had asked for there to be a special occasion for Cyprus on the 50 years of the Cyprus occupation. Now, Cyprus is the only occupied member state of the European Union. There are three factors behind this: NATO, the Greek junta, and Turkish expansionism. For 51 years, Cypriots have been experiencing the fear and hypocrisy, despite the UN resolutions that are out there. 951 Cypriot families seek for responsibility to finally be taken as concerns this issue by the European institutions. Finally, so that their missing persons can be brought back. The right of people to bury, to say goodbye, to honor their dead for one last time. As long as this reality is not resolved, it will be an open wound. We call for a united Cyprus where Greeks and Cypriots can live together. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Panayotou for 1 minute, please.
Call is been missing since the Turkish invasion of my country Cyprus in 1974. This had a huge impact in my family. My father was 7 years old when he witnessed a suicide attempt by my grandmother because she couldn't handle it. My uncle is one of the 2,000 Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots who had disappeared, mainly during the Turkish invasion in 1974 and the intercommunal fighting of 1964. The remains of these committees people are searched by a communal committee, and by today half of them have been identified and returned to their relatives, who, unlike my grandmother, were lucky enough to live until that day of relief. I want to thank the European Union because it's the biggest funder of this committee, giving so far €35 million. Please continue to fund this project, which not only brings peace to the families like mine, but it also encourages the cooperation between the two communities of the island, increasing the chance of a potential solution to the Cyprus problem.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Belleris for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes it clear that everyone has the right to dignity and justice. But what dignity and justice is there for those whose fate remains unknown? Let me focus on two countries, on Cyprus, where for 50 years thousands of families are still missing their loved ones since 1974, and Albania, where 34 years after the fall of the dictatorial regime, 6,000 people who perished because of the communist atrocities are missing. The same phenomena has been observed in other countries as well. In 2015, there was a resolution for the opening of the mass graves in Ornithi on Cyprus. This was a UN resolution. This has to be done once again. This has to be done many, many times, because behind each one of these individuals missing, there is a family, there is a community, there are people suffering. Thank you.
Por un minuto.
Thank you. Ms. Pahin, 1 minute.
Aquí este debate.
Thank you. I hope this can be a sincere debate without hypocrisy, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a peace declaration for all people to be able to live in freedom with the same rights. There are groups here who distinguish between different humanitarian incidents and different types of victim. What do they say to the victims of Gaza and other crises? You can judge them by that. Many years after that declaration, we still had a long dictatorship with disappearances and deaths in my own country. What did they say about that? We need to look at history before we can look towards the future. A Europe without memory means young people not knowing how freedom was gained. We need a right to historical memory, to justice and reparation. And we call for a law that will end impunity. We need to fight for history, the recognition of what occurred in the whole of Europe and Spain.
Para señor Everding.
Thank you. Mr. Everding, 1 minute.
Liebe Kolleginnen und
Colleagues, how can a lasting peace be achieved in many places of the world if families have no answer to the fate of their family members? This is one of the biggest barriers for the healing and reconciliation and reconstructing societies. The figures are shocking, because more than 71,000 people are missed in Africa and 42,000 in Ukraine, not just soldiers, also civilians. But we don't have to look so far away, because also in Central Europe, 10,000 people are missing. And the remains of the collapse of Yugoslavia have never been found. So the international community in the EU must take steps urgently to find a proper way to clear up the fate of and whereabouts of missing persons, because without progress, given the pain, the loss, and the perceived injustice, there can't be any lasting peace. I close with the words of George Bernard Shaw. War is a state of affairs where people shoot each other who don't know each other, at the orders of people who know each other but don't shoot each other. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Ahora es el turno para el señor.
Thank you. Mr. Saudargas, 1 minute.
Colleagues, 63,000 Ukrainian people, both military and civilians,
are listed as missing. Arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances have become routine Russian tactics. Among those reported missing are Ukrainian prisoners of war who face brutal treatment and are unlawfully prosecuted under false criminal charges. In its treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war, Russia is violating the Geneva Convention. One of the most distressing aspects of this crisis is the abduction of Ukrainian children. Since the beginning of the invasion, nearly 20,000 children have been forcibly taken to Russia. This is part of a calculated policy of genocide against Ukrainians. The identity of these children is being erased. They are stripped of their Ukrainian heritage, issued new Russian identity papers and placed for adoption. Tracking and recovering them is an immensely difficult task. The European Union cannot stand by. It is vital to support identification efforts and the creation of a global genetic database. Impose sanctions on individuals and entities involved in war crimes. Let us provide assistance to Ukrainian authorities in their search for the missing. Slava Ukraini.
Muchas gracias. Ahora es el turno.
Thank you. Ms. Mendez, 1 minute. Thank you, President. I've just been to Palestine and Israel. It was very difficult there. I saw destruction, desperation and precarious conditions for thousands of people trying to get by, including children. Gaza has one of the highest population densities of the world, and it's faced these challenges for years now. It has limited resources, systemic problems since October 2023. Conditions have worsened dramatically. All wars and conflicts leave the wounds of those who've disappeared in Argentina, Turkey. I'm Still Here, the Brazilian film, and Palestine is no exception. Families suffer for decades. Syria, Cyprus, Ukraine, still ongoing. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights calls for justice and for voices to be heard so that historical memory is respected in order to achieve freedom and human rights. Ms. Mendez, there's a blue card for you. Will you accept it? It's from Mr. Oliveira. Thank you, President. Ms. Mendes, you referred to Palestine and the Gaza Strip. I have a question about that. Only a few days ago, we heard Donald Trump say that he intends to buy and occupy the Gaza Strip, expelling Palestinians, preventing them from coming back and using force if necessary to expel them. Do you believe that this European Parliament should take a firm position condemning those remarks and repudiating this infringement of international human rights and the rights of the people of Palestine? This is ethnic cleansing and incitement to genocide. Do you not agree? Thank you very much. I agree that President Trump's remarks are not only infamy, calumny, direct violation of international law, tantamount to ethnic cleansing of that territory, and yes, this European Parliament should take concrete action and vehemently condemn those remarks relating to people who are already suffering.
Turno para el señor Bellamy.
Mr. Bellamy, 1 minute 30. Thank you, President, Commissioner. 50 years after Turkey's invasion of Cyprus, hundreds of Cypriots are still formally disappeared. Their families have not only lost loved ones, they've lost the truth. They've been denied the truth, and without the truth they cannot mourn. It's not abstract. Fidias Panayotou gave us a very clear personal example of what this can mean for a family when there are people who are just not there anymore. I was talking to a Cypriot friend a few weeks ago And this friend said, yes, the war was awful, but I think the post-war period of not knowing where the people we lost are was even worse. So it is our duty to come together on this. As a rapporteur, I want to work together with all political groups in this hemicycle. Surely this transcends political differences. Turkey should cooperate and tell the truth. In that way, we will finally know and allow families to mourn. We'll give families the truth. Time is passing. There are generations who won't be around for very long, and they have the right to know what happened to their loved ones before they leave us. We've seen many calls by the court. Turkey finally needs to provide that cooperation. We need it, justice needs it, truth requires it, and the families, the cause that unites us here, require it. Thank you very much. Ms. Laurent, 1 minute.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, President, Madam Commissioner, colleagues. In 2024, the International Committee of the Red Cross said that in Africa alone, 61,000 people were missing because of armed conflicts, violence, and the migration context. That's 75% more than in 2019. These disappearances are the result of the disastrous human conditions. Behind each disappeared person, many more people suffer from the uncertainty. In Europe, it would be imaginable to not look for disappeared persons, in particular children. It's urgent to talk about these persons, to recognise the suffering, the desperation of people, and the duty of the European Union to clear up the fate of people. A lot of people disappear on their perilous journey towards Europe. We must look at the impact of its migration policy on the risk of disappearance for migrants and have better operations at sea to come to come and save these people.
Por un minuto.
Mr. López Aguilar, 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The EU's role in humanitarian crisis resolution and locating disappeared persons in conflicts and wars is not only a vital role, it is also entirely consistent with our values. It is clear that memory, reparation, truth are the way. We saw this in Cyprus. It was my honour to be rapporteur of this European Parliament on disappeared persons. It is the right path. That is what the Spanish law on democratic memory says. That those regional governments that are currently in the hands of the right and the far right have cancelled the victim census and the mass grave exhumation process and the symbols of the dictatorship. For the sake of the victims, the dignity of the victims, we need to pay tribute to memory, reparation and truth. Thank you, President. Thank you. Mr. Andriukaitis, 1 minute.
The Commissioner, thank you very much. Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, coming at the end of a long list of failures by the international community to prevent abuse of human rights and mass atrocities, makes one thing clear. The direction of the human rights initiative today is no longer a question of advances or setbacks. It is a question of whether human rights will manage to remain relevant to international politics and whether they can retain their places as rubrics of international law and institutionalized diplomacy between states. The European continent and the Middle East are at war. The authoritarian regimes, the far right and populists are inciting hatred and social division and create difficulties in solving humanitarian crisis. The President of the United States suspending funding for humanitarian programs deepens humanitarian crisis, especially in the area of persons missing in the wars and conflicts. The European Union must strengthen the global system. We must ensure that even in time of military conflicts, warring parties respect their human rights and commitments. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora es el turno para...
Thank you. Ms. Guzenina, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Right now, as we speak, thousands of Ukrainian children have been ripped from their homes, torn from the arms of their families, forcefully deported to Russia and Belarus, detained in Russian prisons, forced into adoption, stripped of their identities. These children are being erased, a grave violation of international law. Even in this room, I have heard Russian propaganda attempting to twist this horror into something it is not. Let me say this plainly. This is not a topic for propaganda. This is a moral line that demands the united will of the entire European Parliament. We must act now. The EU must impose sanctions against those responsible for these atrocities. And more than that, we must demand that these children, these stolen lives, are returned to their homes, to their families, to their loved ones. These children are not just numbers in a report. They are lives stolen. And we must not let them be forgotten. So bring them home.
Muchas gracias. Con esto daríamos por aquí.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the speeches under that item. Catch the Eye, though, has 8 speakers. I'll try to take you all, but please do stick to 1 minute. Mr. Haji Pantela, from your seat, please.
Mike. Mike.
President, colleagues, I would like to remind you that because of the Turkish invasion and occupation of my country, Cyprus, families of missing individuals are waiting for their loved ones to come back. The occupying forces of Erdogan has not cooperated to provide any sort of information concerning the fate of these individuals. We call upon the solidarity and support of the European Union to close this open wound, which is a terrible stigma for the entire continent. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Tinkinen, 1 minute.
Arvoisa President, when the terrorist organization Hamas took innocent civilians as hostages, you can't imagine the situation. If you had to think yourself, if my loved one will ever come back, and if that person comes back, what types of horrors have they been through? Many people and families are having to think that at the moment in Ukraine. Will my son come back ever? If he comes back, what will his most recent moments have been like? If we talk about running down defence or rooting out terrorism, it's not just a question of politics. We're talking about saving families. If we're faced by these threats, we need a tough line. The left is opposing this. I can't understand what is wrong with your values.
Gracias. Ahora es el turno para la señora Miranda.
Thank you. Ms. Miranda, 1 minute.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. We're talking about humanitarian law here. But where is Ms. Callas? Here we are in our plenary session in Strasbourg. Does she think that's not important? How many people have disappeared in Gaza? Can Ms. Callas answer that? Genocide and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Since 30th of January, we've seen expulsions, but we've seen no declarations from President von der Leyen about this unjust, arbitrary violation of international humanitarian law. We've heard nothing. And now we hear a proposal for ethnic cleansing from Mr. Trump. Selling Gaza. What's that all about, Ms. Callas? It's shameful. It is time to end this unbearable cynicism when it comes to international humanitarian law. We need to act for peace, human rights and respect for international law organisations. Thank you, President. Thank you. Mr. Oliveira, 1 minute. Thank you, President. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has at its centre values of progress for people and friendly relations between nations. If you look at that declaration and then see barbaric wars and the consequences for the victims, we do have to ask, what can EU institutions do about barbaric behaviour by the State of Israel towards Palestine? Commissioner Albuquerque, where are the EU institutions when the US President is making the kind of declarations which he has done over the last few years? He's been talking about ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinian people, occupying the Gaza Strip and expelling Palestinians from their own land and preventing them from coming back. Where have the EU institutions been when we've heard these very clear, open calls for a violation of international humanitarian law? Be brave enough to stand up for international law. Be brave enough to stand up for the human rights of Palestinians.
Señora Jovanovici.
Thank you. Ms. Jovanovici, 1 minute.
Thank you. You speak of human rights, but this is the institution that most frequently violates them. Starting with the pandemic, you destroyed everything about human rights. You defend Israel, but you refuse to see that over 45,000 women and children died. You speak of Ukraine, but why don't you speak of the Romanians in Ukraine, over 1 million of them that are being exterminated by Zelensky, your favorite? You can't even see the fact that Ursula von der Leyen supported the Romanian president, Mr. Klaus Werner Iohannis, who has been involved in child trafficking. I would like to tell you that today, Mr. Klaus Werner Iohannis, under political pressure, has resigned. You violated and you allowed the violation of human rights. You killed people during the pandemic, and you kill people by sending guns to Ukraine, and you mock everything that the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip represent.
Para el siguiente punto, para el siguiente...
Mr. Aftias, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I think we have to move forward in a decisive fashion with social measures, because without human beings, societies can't move forward. Salaries, pensions, inflation, housing, all of these issues require from us immediate action, immediate mobilization. No society can live and can survive without having an anthropocentric approach. At the same time, we have to support individuals that are being threatened by artificial intelligence, writers, artists, screenplay writers. Their work is being copied, it's being counterfeited. So we have to move in that direction as well, to help individuals, help support knowledge, because society cannot wait any longer. We need to act immediately. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rakete, 1 minute.
Ich muss sagen, diese Debatte erfüllt.
This debate makes me angry, because there are thousands of victims and their remains are on the seabed of the Mediterranean. People who are fleeing and the EU let them die. Nobody saved them. This crisis, this return policy is being decided here. It's a disgrace. I've worked on a ship and we had to notify bodies to the Coast Guard. They never like to do that. They have to identify them or to bury corpses. There are thousands of families in Africa who are looking for their relatives, and all of these people could have been saved if the EU only had a proper sea rescue mission properly financed. I'd like to thousands of volunteers of the Red Crescent in Libya and Tunisia who deal with the remains and the bodies of those who've disappeared.
Muchas gracias. Y en último...
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Papadakis.
Only in the Ukraine do you see missing individuals. The thousands in Gaza, not a word has been said. 51 years after the Turkish invasion and occupation on Cyprus, that too led to thousands dead and individuals missing. It's unacceptable. After so many years, families of these individuals with their communities and associations have had to deal with this issue with no solution on the horizon. National governments have not been successful in facilitating these individuals, irrespective of the work that's been done by the UN Missing Persons Agency. Turkey has kept its national archives on this issue closed. So we don't know where these individuals are buried, where they have been moved, where the remains are. Turkey has to open its military archives. We have to have identification of the remains, and we have to have support of the families as well until the last missing person has finally been identified and returned. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this important debate, and we move on to the next item, Article 160.